the issues affecting Asia's animals, and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia, and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Asia for Animals podcast. My name is Craig with Asia for Animals Coalition, and we are going to be joined today by Chris Sherwood, the CEO of RSPCA here in the UK. We're doing episodes where we meet the core members of Asia for Animals Coalition. What does that mean? Well, a lot of our listeners know that Asia for Animals is one of the biggest networks of animal protection groups in the world. We have around 300 organizations on our network, but within that, at the moment, we currently have 26 core members who take a leading role in the coalition and support its development. And RSPCA is another one of those. So we're really delighted to have Chris, the leader of RSPCA, with us today. Chris has more than 20 years experience in the social sector, having worked for leading UK charities including Relate and Scope. He's spent time in central government working for the UK's innovation agency Nesta and started his career in local government. Chris is a board member for Eurogroup for Animals, NCFO, the main membership body for the social sector in England, and the Centre for Ageing Better, and more recently became the president of World Federation for Animals. Chris also chairs the UK's Charity Awards and is a recognised commentator on animal welfare, with his views frequently being carried by national and international media outlets. Chris has appeared regularly on TV, radio and in print media, including BBC Breakfast, Sky, CNN, Wired, The Economist, Guardian, Daily Mail, The Mirror and The Times. And as the Chief Executive Officer of RSPCA, he's been in that role since 2018. He's led the organisation through a major programme of transformation, which he sets out in an ambitious strategy called Together for Animal Welfare, which listeners can read at rspca.org.uk. He has a 15-year-old cat, which is a rescue cat from the RSPCA called Marmalade. Now, I've had the pleasure to meet Chris in person a couple of times. Most recently was in Borneo at the Asia for Animals conference. And I think maybe when we were there, although it's almost a year ago now, I think maybe we touched on the idea of getting him in on this podcast. So Chris, welcome. It's really great to finally have you here. How are you?
Good morning, Craig, and thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really, really delighted to be here as well. It's great. And I'm dialing in today from our London hub. Busy day ahead of lots of meetings, but always great to make time for Asia for Animals, because I love you guys and you do fantastic work across Asia. So great to be talking to you today, Craig.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we're mainly here to discuss today RSPCA celebrating its 200th anniversary. But first, I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your work, your remit. How many people and functions do you oversee? Just give our listeners an impression of the scale of RSPCA, how many animals it's rescuing each year, how many functions, how many staff are you overseeing, this kind of thing.
Well, where do we start, Craig? I mean, the RSPCA is an amazing organisation, and it is such a privilege to be its chief executive for over 6 years now. But it's a big organisation and it's got some complexity to it. So you asked about the dynamics of the organisation. So the RSPCA employs about 1,700 people. Between us and our branch network, we have more than 10,000 volunteers. We have nearly 140 independent branches in England and Wales who are part of the RSPCA family, and they're responsible for 80% of the rehoming work of companion animals. We have a trading subsidiary. We also have the world's largest farm welfare certification scheme, RSPCA Assured as well, which certifies nearly 4,000 farms across the UK. So it's a big organisation. We do really three things. First of all, we're really well known for the work of our inspectorate. So we're the leading investigatory body for animal cruelty in England and Wales, and we're also the main prosecuting body. We respond to over 1 million calls a year, and we're triggering more than 100,000 investigations a year. It's really difficult at the moment because the cost of living crisis, our animal shelters are full. We're taking in lots of animals at the moment because of those concerns around the cost of living crisis. The second key part of what we do is in our name, the P in our name, prevention. So we run a range of education and information programs to really get the tools and skills out there so people get it right for animals, because most of our work, if not all of our work, is connected to humans getting it wrong when it comes to animals. And then the third part of what we do is campaigning. And we've been campaigning since 1824. It's in the DNA of the organisation, and in our over 200 years of being in existence, we've led to more than 400 laws being passed in the Westminster Parliament. And we know that legislation is seen as the gold standard and is often replicated around the globe as well. So, yeah, we do three things: rescue and care work, prevention, and our campaigning work as well.
Wow. Thank you very much for that overview, because I just want to give listeners, a lot of our listeners are in Asia, and maybe they don't know that RSPCA here in the UK is really part of daily life. It's such a household name. So many people in the country just wouldn't know where to turn without it. So it really is like part of society, and we're very grateful to have it. My next question within, that enormous remit that you shared, is there a typical day in the life of Chris Sherwood work? But I'm going to guess that maybe there isn't a typical day.
No, there's not a typical day in my life as the chief exec. But to be honest with you, Craig, that's one of the things I love about the job that I do, because I would go crazy if I was stuck in an office all day. Because the thing, if you know about me, is, Craig, we've met each other a couple of times before, is I'm a people person. And where I draw my energy and my commitment from is being out there engaging with volunteers, with our supporters, with our staff, with our branches, with our inspectorate, and engaging with the public as well. And I love to chat. And I'm always interested in stories. It's where I draw my energy from as well. So there is no typical day. Some days you could be meeting cabinet ministers. Sometimes you could be attending, very austere, impressive events wearing a suit. And other days you can be rolling your sleeves up and cleaning out a cat litter tray. So there is no typical day in the life of the RSPCA. But you know what? In this job, I've got to do some amazing things and meet some amazing people, hear some amazing stories, and that is an incredible privilege, really. So yeah, I feel very honoured to be able to have done this job for over 6 years now.
Wow. Yeah, amazing. So let's touch on, you already mentioned the society was founded in 1824, so we're celebrating its 200th year this year. So looking at RSPCA's history, for listeners, it's the Royal Society for the Prevention Against Cruelty to Animals. So at what point did it get the royal endorsement in its history?
Well, and so 200 years old, we recently entered, Craig, you're probably not aware of this, the Guinness Book of World Records as officially the oldest animal charity in the world. And we were founded in a coffee shop in Soho, in the centre of London, by kind of leading statesmen of the Victorian era. Well, actually not Victorian era, of the 19th century, it's pre-Queen Victoria, including the Reverend Richard Martin and William Wilberforce, who came together and said it's not right and it needs to change. And we were founded 2 years after the first ever piece of legislation to protect animals, the Reverend Richard Martin's Cattle Act of 1822. So, we are the oldest charity in the world looking after animals, and we sparked a whole movement. But you asked about when did we get our engagement with the royal family? Well, Queen Victoria, when she was a princess, actually knew about the work of the RSPCA. And Princess Victoria, as she was then, was a really big fan of animals. She particularly loved her dogs. And she heard about a terrible incident that involved one of our inspectors in West London, who was tragically killed while trying to break up a cockfighting ring in West London. And this really moved her. And her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and Princess Victoria started their involvement with the RSPCA then. And she became queen in 1837. And one of the first things that she did fairly early in her position as head of state was award the royal status to the RSPCA in 1840. So we were actually up to that day the SPCA, but in 1840 we became the Royal Society. And there's only one other Royal Society in the world, which is in Australia. And they also have the royal name as well, our sister charity, RSPCA Australia. And we got that royal status then. And our relationship with the monarchy has continued to this day. We were really delighted to hear this year that His Majesty, the King, decided to become our patron after our 70-year relationship with the late Queen Elizabeth II. So that relationship with the monarchy continues to this day, which is important because, they are the head of state and they have that position and that influence in the world when opining on various issues. And you can see that from the King himself in his opining on issues around climate change and the effect that has on public debate.
Amazing. Yeah. And I think it's important as well for like let's say the common man in the UK who maybe doesn't know very much about animals or whatever, that royal endorsement really crystallizes or solidifies something in his conscience that like, oh yeah, it's a really important part of daily life, which as we covered it is. And it's interesting what you said about Queen Victoria, because I think historically she wasn't known for her soft side. So it's nice to know that she really had that soft spot for animals. So focusing a little bit on the SPCA part. So as we covered, RSPCA is one of the core members of Asia for Animals Coalition, but alongside it, we have SPCAs in other countries. And I'm wondering, like, because the RSPCA in the UK dates so far back, do you think that it was responsible in any way for kind of catalyzing a model for SPCAs abroad? Is that part of the history, or do you think that maybe SPCAs as a thing would have arisen in different countries anyway?
Well, we know that the RSPCA in the 19th century and right up actually into the middle of the 20th century actually had an active policy of sparking SPCAs around the world. So, I mean, it is of a different era, but we did have an empire committee of the RSPCA, which actually had that remit. So we were providing seed funding and expertise to help spark those SPCAs around the world. So that was part of the movement and the models, although there are always differences related to different jurisdictions. You know, in England and Wales, for instance, we have this concept of private prosecutions, which means that we are a private prosecutor of animal cruelty and neglect in England and Wales. Private prosecutions don't exist in every jurisdiction. So we've got these idiosyncrasies, but, you know, that model is pretty consistent around the world as well. The second part of your question, Craig, was would something have happened if the RSPCA hadn't done something? Absolutely. And you know why? Because I think that as society develops, our consciousness around how we relate to each other, how we relate to animals, and how we relate to the planet has become a much more pressing issue in modern times. So whether it was the RSPCA being set up or another NGO, I think that moral consciousness, that sense of how we relate to one another, how we relate to animals, how we relate to the planet, you know, someone would have stepped in there to do something as well. I think that kind of slow tide of history is moving in the direction of actually how we relate to animals really matters, not just for animal welfare, but for human welfare as well. And we've got that responsibility to each other, that responsibility to animals and the responsibility to the planet. So I'm sure something would have filled that vacuum because it needed to.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. So on your point about RSPCA's kind of enforcement powers, I guess my question is like, when you see SPCAs in other countries, let's say our focus on this podcast, of course, is Asia, is there anything that you think works particularly well about RSPCA's approaches in the UK that might be transferable, or is it just that you'd like to see other SPCAs develop like kind of enforcement powers such as you have? Or
Well, there's quite a bit in there. I mean, first of all, the RSPCA has got a lot to learn from our sister NGOs around the world, which is why we're so committed and active in networks like Asia for Animals, because we don't claim to have all the answers to all these questions. I think that in England and Wales, we committed in our strategy, which you mentioned in the opening remarks, Craig, Together for Animal Welfare, to look at moving our prosecutorial role over to the government in England and Wales through its agency, the Crown Prosecution Service, because we are one of three big private prosecutors in England and Wales, but we're dealing with increasingly complex cases. And we're also dealing with cases that can result in somebody being imprisoned for 5 years. And we do think that is much more commensurate with the state. And I know that from talking to my peers around the world that we're all having this debate about what best sits with the state and what best sits with the social sector in organisations like the RSPCA as well. And as our work becomes more in demand, you know, look to the future, the challenges for animal welfare greater than they were in the past. You know, that debate is an important one about where does our role start and end vis-a-vis the state. And when it comes to things like prosecutions, you know, we're landing on the sort of space that, you know, it's very much the government should be doing. Why, you know, do they accept responsibility for humans but not for animals? Why do they accept responsibility for fraud or for, you know, kind of environmental impact but not for animal welfare as well? So we think there's a debate to be had around what best sits where, whose role it is as well. I think one thing that I would say that if I look around the world and say, what's the thing that is unique about the RSPCA and I think is a real asset of ours, and it's our scientific knowledge. You know, we are an organisation that's evidence-based. We have a large scientific team. Our positions, whether it's our standards when it comes to farming of animals or our policy positions when it comes to the use of animals in science, they're informed by the scientific evidence. And I think that's really important because, as you described my background, it's from human welfare services. The research evidence around what works and what doesn't work when it comes to human welfare is massive. Yet when it comes to animal welfare and animal science, we're still really in the infancy of that scientific knowledge as well. So that evidence, that experience, that expertise that we bring to bear, I think is really important, because it's very easy to contest our beliefs, but it's much harder to contest our knowledge and expertise that comes from science.
Yeah, absolutely. On that point, like, I recently spoke to one of the research team at Faunalytics who made a comment. Actually, I think in an earlier episode of our podcast, he mentioned this, that, one thing that we have on our side in the animal protection movement is that the data tends to always be on our side. It's just the nature of things. So it's great to hear that echoed. And going back to your previous comment, yeah, it sounds like the role of SPCAs in society is very much tied up with the kind of need for binding policy commitments and legal change and whatnot, which I want to touch on a bit later in the conversation, coming back to your work with WFA. But for the time being, I want to just bring it back to the celebration of RSPCA's 200th year. So it's a special year, and we've seen some amazing content coming out from RSPCA, including a really bold new rebranding. Wondered if you could tell our listeners more about the rebranding, like how far in advance did you start working on this and why did you feel it was needed?
Yeah, it's been a big year for us this year with lots of change, which can be daunting but also exciting taking place. And part of looking at our 200th anniversary was we really thought about what do we need to be thinking about as we look to the future. I go back to the point I made earlier in the conversation, which is the animal welfare challenges are actually going to be greater in the future than they were in the past. When we were set up in 1824, we didn't have routine use of animals in science. A factory farm hadn't been invented then. Extreme breeding of cats and dogs wasn't a feature of companion animal life 200 years ago. So looking to the future, the need for our work, the need for our intervention is going to be greater. And we know we can't do it alone, that we need more people to enroll in the kind of change that we want to see if we're to create that world where all animals are treated with kindness and compassion and respect. That's what we want to see in the world. So we really looked at ourselves and thought, are we an organisation that through the way we position ourselves and look and feel and talk, are we helping to build that movement? And the RSPCA is incredibly famous. We're incredibly well known. 99% of the population in England and Wales knows who the RSPCA is, which puts us up there with Coca-Cola and Jesus Christ. We're incredibly well known. But when it comes to are we understood, those numbers go down, and what we do and what we don't do. And when it comes to consideration to give time, money or voice, we underperform around that as well. So we're incredibly famous, but not as well known as we could be. And so we've got to work harder. And we've got to work harder not because this is about the RSPCA, this is about animal welfare. So we really looked at this. And what we really realized was that, the RSPCA, when it's performing well, is really inspiring everyone to create a better world for every kind of animal. And that wasn't what our brand talked to. So, you asked about time. This has been about a 2-year piece of work because we haven't rebranded the organisation since 1971, which is quite a long time ago. That's before the United Kingdom joined the EU. Let's not talk about Brexit today on this podcast, though. But, it's a long time ago. And so this was about looking to the future, and this was about looking to what do we need to be doing as an organisation. And if we're to make that big impact on animal welfare, then we've got to inspire more people to come with us on the journey as well. And that's what our brand has been designed to do. And it seems to be working. And I'm particularly keen that we, through that brand work as well, we looked at how we engage younger audiences as well, because I think we talked before, Craig, you and I are not too different in our ages. I'm a little bit older than you, but when we were at school, when we were growing up, we didn't have the experience that young people have today through social media. Instances of animal cruelty and neglect were really rare when we were growing up, whereas today, actually, a significant number of young people see it through social media. And this is some of the fantastic work that Asia for Animals has been doing as well, and which I'm really pleased to see. So we've got to work even harder with that younger audience to tell them a different story about what a healthy, good relationship with the animal kingdom looks like as well. So that's what our brand has been designed to do, is to connect with those younger audiences, because those are the future campaigners and fundraisers and rescue workers. but they're seeing stuff that we just didn't see. They've got that experience of cruelty and abuse on their mobile phones in their bedrooms, and we've got to be out there challenging that, and our brand is helping us do that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much in there. Like, first of all, yeah, I agreed that working in the movement for the past 6 years, it kind of feels like the movement is globally ready for this kind of next step up. And as you said, like looking at the really long-term future. And yeah, absolutely. Congratulations on the rebrand and all the content. Like, one incredible piece of content I saw was this animated video, again, linking to your thing about reaching younger people. And thank you, by the way, for pointing out our similar ages. Very grateful for that. Reaching younger people on the social medias with this great video that was encompassing lots of different kinds of animals in lots of different situations. So it's kind of getting the message across that this is not just about how we care for companion animals or farmed animals. It's really like respecting animal sentience and just respecting kind of life. And I think it's a really great message. And I really hope it does bring the kind of younger people along with the journey. And I'm sure it will be successful. Is there anything else this year that's massive in the plan for the celebrations?
Well, there is, but my colleagues will tell me off very strongly if I start to reveal details. But watch this space, Craig. And look, we are so proud of the fact, and I think it's not just for the RSPCA, it's for the movement that, 200 years ago this year, we started not just the RSPCA, but we actually started the animal protection movement, which has gone from strength to strength. And we can see how we're changing the conversation around animal sentience and about animal welfare, about animal protection. But yeah, we have a few more events coming up as well. So watch this space. We're very excited about those.
Yeah, good to know. And for listeners, this is being recorded in early August. So, a lot of the celebrations may have taken place already, but definitely check up on RSPCA's social channels to see what else they're planning for this year. Touching on your international work outside of the UK, I mean, you just intimated there that, yeah, absolutely, RSPCA played a leading role in really kickstarting the movement globally. So you're a very active member of Asia for Animals Coalition, we're happy to say, and for a long time. Can you tell our listeners about some of the international programs that you have and maybe particularly those in Asia?
Of course, Craig. I mean, I think during my time, as I said, I've been RSPCA's chief executive for just over 6 years now. We've really recognised that we are an international organisation and we need to be, because animal welfare transcends national borders. And that's been even particularly more the case when we see the impact of Brexit and the fact that the UK is now negotiating trade deals with other jurisdictions in its own name rather than doing it through Brussels. And animal welfare is coming to the fore in those. We are starting to see some, certainly under the last government, some concerning trends whereby we were starting to water down our standards in the pursuit of a free trade deal with other jurisdictions. So, and that's just on trade, but actually whether it comes to climate change, whether it comes to zoonotic diseases, animal welfare transcends national borders. So we need to think internationally and look to work internationally. The main way we do that as an organisation is that we do that by working with our international partners, whether that's Asia for Animals, whether that is Eurogroup, or more recently with the World Federation for Animals, because I've been around that table since its conception, and working through those different groups so that we've actually got the right support for lobbying and advocating at, whether that's the European Commission, whether that's the UN. We've got those kind of bodies there advocating on behalf of the movement. So we work a lot through those different networks. And we do work in East Asia, and we have a fantastic colleague, Paul Littlefair, who's our head of international, who has a long-standing working relationship, particularly in the People's Republic of China, but has also worked in South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan as well. And a lot of that work is around education programs for teachers and for other public service professionals. So really building that expertise out there as well and advocating at the grassroots level. So yeah, most of our work is through those international institutions, but we do have experience of being on the ground in some of those jurisdictions. I think, there are some questions for us about collaboration. We're still a really small sector in the grand scheme of things. The RSPCA, being one of the largest, if not the largest, animal protection organisation in the world, is actually not a very big organisation when you're looking at who we're up against. So we have got some challenges around that as well. And I think given what I see in the future, the effects of extreme emergency events and climate change, there are some questions for us as a sector about how are we responding in those disaster recovery situations as well. The international NGOs struggle when it comes to human welfare. We struggle when it comes to protecting animals, whether that's from wildfires or earthquakes or other climate-related events as well. So we've got some questions about how we work together as a movement moving forward. But I know that we are stronger together and we're a stronger voice for animal protection when we work through our collaborative institutions like Asia for Animals, which is why we're so proud to be an active participant in the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're very right to point out that, we talked at the start about how big an organization, how impressive an organization RSPCA is, and it sounds like, it's very large. But you're right, in the grand scheme of things, our movement is still fairly small. Like when you look at how society gives charitable donations to other causes, the animal cause within there is very low down. And so it can feel a bit like a David and Goliath situation sometimes. And one of the tools that we have in our box to create these bigger changes that will cause changes in favour of animals with regard to, for example, the trade regulations and implications there that you mentioned, is policy advocacy. So something we're really proud of at Asia for Animals is that together with RSPCA and I think 18 other really prominent charities, we were both founder members of the World Federation for Animals, and you recently became the president of WFA for this new term. So can you say something to our listeners about the importance of the Federation and why maybe NGOs listening to this should think about connecting with, for example, we have our Asia Policy Coalition, and just begin to learn about how can they take up that kind of policy advocacy at the national level? How does it feed into international fora? Why should they participate in that kind of work?
Wow, that's a great question, Craig, and one I feel incredibly passionate about. So prepare yourself for this one. Look, it comes back to we've got to get animal welfare in the global architecture. And what I mean by that is that the United Nations, doesn't have a clear public statement through something like a declaration on the rights of animals, on animal sentience, on animal welfare. And the Sustainable Development Goals, which then feed down into nation-state policies and priorities, animal welfare is almost invisible in those Sustainable Development Goals. So, the fact that there are billions of animals on our planet, the global architecture set up in the post-war period of the United Nations and other groupings, whether that's the G20 or the World Trade Organization, animal protection, animal welfare is invisible unless it's about the commodification of animals for their flesh and for their dairy products. And that, for me, is a real problem. And how we work at the UN level to be able to get animal welfare there in the successor to Sustainable Development Goals and achieve that UN declaration on animal welfare is incredibly important, because that does influence public opinion. It does influence debates between nation states. And of course, it does start to influence nation state priorities as well. And I'm not making that up. We can see that through the rights of children, which has gone through the UN and through the work of UNICEF. And we can also see that in the rights of disabled people, which in an earlier part of my career, I had some limited involvement in as well, in how that's been reflected through UN priorities and institutions. So we've got a big task to do. But I go back to, we're still a really small sector when you consider who we might be working with or against, whether that's farmers, whether that's food producers. We've got some big lobbies there who've got some vested interests around animal welfare. We've got to work much harder. And the only way I think we really achieve that is by working in collaboration through institutions like the World Federation for Animals and Asia for Animals or Eurogroup or ANOR at a regional level as well. So that for me is why it's important. We've got to ensure that, coming through, and this isn't about today, this isn't about the next couple of years, this is about where we're going to be in decades ahead. The UN works across that multi-decade kind of period in terms of planning. We can't be sat here in 2050 when, we'll be old men of the sector by then, Craig, thinking about the fact that we still haven't got animal protection in the UN's policy framework. This is what we're trying to fight for here, is to make sure that animal protection, that animals get their recognition in the fact that they matter in and of themselves because they are sentient beings, not because they are a product to be traded. And that's the piece of work that I think we've got to do.
Yeah. Absolutely. I worked for a short time for WFA. I was happy to meet Chris when I was there, and I saw firsthand colleagues, suggest wording in favour of animals in these big global binding documents or commitments. And I can see that kind of work increasing throughout the movement. And like you said, it has value for so many reasons. And we do need to be looking at the next kind of decades. As we know in the movement, like protection of animals kind of touches on lots and lots of human development issues. So it's super important. And I would just reiterate to listeners, if you're working with an NGO, you can look at the success of Eurogroup for Animals as a regional policy advocacy body. We can imagine that kind of success is transferable to Asia. So please, if you want to get involved in that kind of work with WFA.org, you could consider joining WFA as a member. You could come to asiaforanimals.com and consider joining our Asia Policy Coalition. And from there, you can kind of learn how to take up that kind of advocacy in line with Chris's advice there. So thanks for that, Chris. And I want to go back now to a comment that you made about, looking back at the last 200 years since RSPCA founded. In some ways, yeah, the situation for animals has really worsened. And this is a huge question, but considering all of that, like what could you see the situation for animals being 200 years from now? But recognizing that question might be too massive, is there anything that you could see in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years that you would like to see come to fruition kind of globally for animals, let's say?
I mean, look, Craig, I am an eternal optimist, and I do believe in, the sense of human progress. And so I do remain optimistic about a positive future for animal protection and for the relationship between humans and animals. You have to be to work in this job. You have to be that eternal optimist and think that progress is better, because I know through the collective endeavours of our movement, we've shifted the dial on what could be the experience of animals today compared to where it was. But look, I'm honest about the fact that we face some greater challenges which are global. Climate change is not a nation state problem. Climate change is a global problem. Economic inequality, which we see through the challenges around migration at the moment in Europe, those are global problems. War in Europe, in Ukraine, possible war in East Asia as well, those will have global implications as well, which is why our global bodies are so important to us as well. So those do pose some particular challenges for us as we move forward. So yeah, in particular challenges sounds really understated. Those could be really challenging for animals as well. So we've got some work to do as we move forward on that as well. And those challenges are bigger than the challenges that were being faced by the movement in the 19th century or the 20th century. But don't get me wrong, we've been there through the Industrial Revolution, we've been there through 2 global wars in the mid-20th century. We've had to respond to those challenges, and I know that as a movement we will step up and respond to the challenges of the future, but they are big. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the challenges that we face in the future go beyond national borders, and that's why collaboration through institutions like Asia for Animals is even more important in the future than perhaps it has been in the past. And that's why I definitely encourage your listeners to join WFA, join Asia for Animals, get involved and get active, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we touched on some really troubling stuff there. Obviously, we've all got huge concerns over climate change, war, all these things that will make our advocacy for animals a lot more difficult. But I feel like within that, it is kind of maybe a nice place to round off our conversation because of your eternal optimism, which, as you said, you probably couldn't do your role without it. We all in the movement kind of need some of that internal optimism. So it's nice and inspiring for you to share that with us. So thanks for that. So yeah, I guess we'll just close by thanking Chris very much for his time and his candor and his conversation. And yeah, thanks very much, Chris. It was great to have you.
It was a real privilege, Craig, and it's always good to see you and say hi to the team at Asia for Animals. And I hope that, this provide some insights for listeners as well. And it's been really great to participate and also good to reflect on some of the questions that you posed to me today as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
No worries. Well, best of luck with everything else that's upcoming for the 200th year, and we will see each other again soon. Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.